You are listening to Medicine and the Machine with Medscape Editor-in-Chief Eric Topol and Master Storyteller and Clinician Abraham Verghese as they talk with experts around the globe about the hottest topics in healthcare. This podcast is intended for U.S. healthcare professionals only.
Hello, this is Eric Topol from Medscape and our podcast, Medicine and the Machine, with my co-host Abraham Verghese. And we're thrilled to have Andy Slavitt with us, and reversing the podcast that Andy has in the bubble. We're putting him in the bubble here today to hear his views about the pandemic, his recent book, Preventable, and to try to forecast where we're headed from here. So I'm going to first turn it over to Abraham, because I know he's just gotten through Preventable.
Yeah, thank you so much, Eric. Andy, such a pleasure to have you on board. And both your tweets and your books are so informative, keeping us informed about what's going on. I have so many highlights in the book that I'm embarrassed to bring them up, but my favorite, it must be the one where you quote someone saying that you can't undie people. And I think that was the most poignant of them for me, because, you know, we have, as of today, 800,000 people who succumb to this epidemic, and you can't just undie them.
Yeah, I just saw this Kaiser study, which I'm sure you both saw, which was I talked about how many people since June we've lost that could have been saved if they'd been vaccinated, and that sent me some chills.
Like 300,000 lives, something like that.
Yeah, I forget what the number was, but it was something over 100, close to 200, maybe 300. But you know, when the numbers get big, of course, we all lose the scope, right? And at this point, you know, we all have to actually work. Ironically, we have to work hard at making those numbers feel real. But you know, it's one thing. You know, human tragedies like this are hard enough, but feeling like it's a different feeling to feel like we have the tools to make it go better and we're not using them.
I must say, it was almost, I hadn't thought of people like Scott Atlas in a long while. So reading the book was revisiting some painful memories along the way.
Apologies for making you rethink about Scott Atlas.
Before we get into the nitty gritty of so many things that I know we want to talk about, and you and Eric are my go-to people for that kind of stuff, I'm curious about the mechanics of the book. Were you writing this along the way? Were you keeping notes? Were you conscious that you were living through a period in history?
Yes. So it's interesting. I had already signed an agreement to write a book before the pandemic started. And I was going to write it on a different topic. Then when the pandemic started, I couldn't write that other book because I was too busy, like Eric and many other people, just with things that we're trying to do to be helpful in the pandemic. And I ended up, you know, talking in the first part of the year with a lot of scientists learning things, and but also a lot of corporate leaders who were trying to do things on the PPE front, and others who were getting in the way. And then I ended up talking to a lot of governors, and I ended up talking to the White House and Jared Kushner and others. And, you know, my publisher was like, well, there's your book. You know, you got a kind of a bird's eye view and also an on the ground view of some things that are going on. Can you make that into a book? And so it kind of the process became, it was almost a bit of a therapy session where I'd have these unbelievable conversations. And I know, Eric, you and I've talked about this, you have this feeling that I know you've had it many times where you're like, oh, I just learned something that people really need to know. Either it's bad and people need to prepare themselves, or it's bad in the sense that the government isn't doing something that they should, and you feel like that needs to go out, or just to be helpful to people, but whatever it is. And for me, there was a certain amount of therapy in feeling like I was perhaps writing one version of a first draft of history.
For our readers, it's a wonderful book, Preventable, and it really sort of helps us relive and an insider's view on what was really happening behind the scenes during those momentous days from March 20 no, March. Well, really, the last 2 years, essentially.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think what's amazing, Andy, is how you called out so much that was preventable. And here it is, we're still marching along, through Delta, a second surge of Delta in the US and moving on to Omicron. And we're still not learning. We're still not implementing many of the lessons that you called out. And I'd like to get, because you are an insider, you spent many months as the White House response team. In fact, I think we miss you profoundly. I talked to Caleb. He said he wants to make sure you come back. Anyway, I don't know if he's been he and others have been twisting your arm, but doing those daily briefings where you really were the moderator and the sharp communicator was essential for the public, for the medical community. And you know what it takes for us to get our arms around this, and we're not doing it. So what can be done given all the obstacles, all the lesions that we face?
Well, first of all, that's very nice of you to say. I feel like in some ways I have a little bit of the advantage of not having your expertise or other people's expertise to weigh me down. So I really viewed being part of that extraordinary team, which is as number one, like I've learned in crisis, you pick one thing that you want to optimize for, and then you just do the damn best you can on everything else. And it was very clear that vaccinating as many people as quickly possible at that point ahead of Alpha, because if we hadn't vaccinated people ahead of Alpha, we would have been dealing with what we ended up dealing with Delta earlier. Didn't know about Delta at the point when we were doing that work, but Alpha was enough of a threat. And we had a lot of impatient and unhappy people who had been overpromised, I think, by the prior administration that they would get their vaccines quickly, and yet people find themselves on websites, not able to get through. And I knew there were another batch of people that weren't sure they wanted to get vaccinated, and we had to deal with them. And the one bit of guidance I got from President Biden was, Andy, don't worry about making me look good. Just give people the information they need. And so I kind of pretended like I was talking to my sister. Like if she asked me, hey, when's the vaccine coming? Or, hey, should I be happier or not about the tests and the ability to get at-home tests? Hey, this or that. And I just felt like I would be in good shape if I just kind of kept it at that level, which is my sister's an extremely smart person who I respect a lot. So I don't doubt her intelligence, but she doesn't know this stuff, and she's got a desperate need to know. And so she can handle bad news. It's not like she needs to be sugar-coated. In fact, if I give her good news when the news is bad, she'll come back and yell at me later. So I might as well just tell her what it is now. And just from the communication aspect of the job, I found that made it all much easier. And then let Tony highlight his expertise, let other people highlight their expertise, because I was not the person who had the expertise. So let the scientists answer the scientific questions, and so from that standpoint, and I was really, I have to say, Eric and Abraham, both of you, I felt like the government was really at a low point, much lower than we are today, I think, in terms of public trust. And I felt like if that wasn't repaired, we were going to have no chance. And I believe government can do big, powerful things, has to be able to do big, powerful things. I believe in our institutions, as flawed as they are. I believe in the CDC. I believe in the FDA. I believe in the career civil servants, and it's the best we got. And so where we're falling down, we've got to improve it. We can't just say, well, we can't trust anybody now, so we might as well be left to our own devices. That was the problem I think we're facing in the first place, is when you couldn't trust anybody, you hunker down and protect you and what's yours. And if we continue to view this pandemic through the light of how's it going to impact me, not who's going to impact us, we're going to be repeating this over and over and over again. And indeed, we still are.
It does seem to follow up on Eric's question that every prediction is that we're going to see the same phenomenon we saw in Delta, with certain states having many more hospitalizations and a great pressure on healthcare workers. But what can we do differently? If you're advising Biden, what are you saying to them that they can actually execute that would make a difference?
Yeah, well, look, I mean, if we start with, I think the facts are, and I think these facts are still being, they're still coming in, and the state of the science is, we're still learning. But from everything I've read from Eric and others, there's very good news in that if you're boosted, you're at about an 80% vaccine efficacy rate, and you probably are doing a fair bit to slow the spread of COVID, even with Omicron. Without being boosted, with 2 vaccine shots, you're probably at 40%. And if you've got prior infection, you're probably a lot less than that. So you start with what are those facts and making sure people see and understand those facts. And then there's a readjustment and rethinking we've got to do, because what that tells us is that we only have 14% of the public vaccinated, boosted. 14%, 47 million people. And we're only gaining a percentage point every 3 days. So in a month, if you can picture Omicron wave kind of really starting to tack on top of Delta, 30 days from now, you'll only be at 25% boosted. And so we're used to thinking about, are you vaccinated? And that's only a portion of the story now. So we have to help people readjust their thinking. And I think they hate it when we tell them that the science has changed, but they'd hate it worse if we didn't tell them the science has changed, and say to people, look, no, you can't say 2 doses let you into that restaurant or let you into the country. You can either say 3, or you just tell people we're taking a big chance, that it's not what it once was. And readjusting people to that mindset is the first and important step, and doing it consistently and clearly, and then saying to people, look, this isn't a year ago. A year ago, we told you the bad news and then said, we have no tools. So your hospitals are going to fill up. You got to stay home, avoid Christmas, all that. 12 months, we've had been extraordinary amount of progress, We now have half a dozen tools that work. We have boosters. We have therapies that are coming. We have rapid at-home tests, which allow people to move about and see their loved ones. We have better, portable ventilators, portable air purifiers to make spaces more ventilated. And we have better surveillance. We're actually doing contact tracing with Omicron. I mean, it's not, people aren't remarking on it, but we actually are able to track these cases as they come in. So it's a different world. If this were a year ago, it's like on or off. Now we don't have to postpone schools necessarily. We can do a lot of the things we do in life safely. And so if I were communicating this, whether from the president or from a governor or from a mayor, I would say, guys, here's the facts. They're neither good nor bad. They're just a reality as we understand it. And we have these tools. Let's aggressively use these tools as much as we can, and with minor changes to our life, very minor changes to our life, we can all experience joy, and we can do it safely.
But Andy, I couldn't agree with you more about the progress and the illusion that we're not making progress, that we're somehow going backwards in terms of the projections, as you've seen, potentially even 1 million cases a day with Omicron, the way it's doubling every 2 days in the UK and Denmark and other places. But what we have is a fact-free fabrication. These are aggressive campaigns of mis and disinformation. And you know that because you've been trying to deal with it when you were at the White House, and it's not gotten any better since when you came home to Pasadena in May, when I joked that when you left, everything kind of went down with the vaccination campaign, but unfortunately, the disinformation has proceeded intensely. And can't something more be done to take that on? Because that's holding us back so much, don't you think?
Yeah, I mean, well, let's have a real honest conversation here, right? At root cause, like probably 20% of the public, I'm gonna maybe oversimplify, but I'm gonna say is anti-science.
Yeah.
They don't believe in institutions. They don't believe what they hear from scientists. They're deeply suspicious. Maybe some portion conspiracy belief, and that predated the pandemic.
Right.
Like, I think if we pretend, like, I don't think we should just look at it as like these are folks that were predisposed and were already there. This is a political wave that Trump rode. I think it's an anti-institutionalist wave that is harder to deal with than transactionally dealing with misinformation. It really is the guts of how people feel about society, about their connection to it, about a bunch of deeper issues. And it's very hard. We then have, beyond that though, we have a lot of people just asking a lot of incredibly reasonable questions that they just need good answers to and just should not get lied to. But if someone says, if you meet somebody who says, hey, this mRNA vaccine, I know a lot of people have taken it, and sure, I get that it was invented a while ago, but it feels new and it feels a little scary. That person's not a moron for asking that question or having that point of view. That person just needs to talk to someone that they trust, who can say, hey, that's a legitimate question. Here's how to think about it. What other legitimate questions do you have? And that person is usually a local person, like a physician or some other trusted person. And unfortunately, I'd love to tell you that can be done at scale. I'd love to tell you that we can educate those folks in a way that, like, one and done. It's this fantasy that there is a Tony Fauci or someone that can educate all those people. And the reality is that those folks are the people that can be persuaded at scale are already persuaded.
But don't you think they're vulnerable to, Andy, to the 20% that you, that's my concern is the 20% are influencing another 30%,
And so this is where I think things like vaccine requirements are actually quite useful, because for a lot of these folks who are on the fence, they don't have strong feelings either way. But if they hear, look, you can't go to your favorite bar, or you can't sign up for your classes at school, or you can't work in your office unless you can demonstrate you're not contagious. These are people, most people, in fact, it's more than the 30%. It's people going up to 90 to 95% of the public don't feel that strongly about being vaccinated or boosted that they would protest that. I mean, most workplaces, including the U.S. military, which has a lot of young people from rural environments, a lot of people of color, a lot of people with all kind of reason to be suspicious, younger, so they don't really feel at ease. They get to 90 to 95%. If you talk to a typical person who's not vaccinated, who's getting vaccinated now for the first time, they're doing it because their employer's requiring it, and you ask them their attitude towards it, they're like, who wants a shot? Who would voluntarily get a shot? I wouldn't, but my employer told me to, so I'm doing it. So we've got to use the techniques that we know work and that some would call coercive. I would actually say they're the nudges that tell people, you got a choice. You don't have to go to that bar. You don't have to go to that stadium. You don't have to take that specific job if you don't want to get vaccinated, or if you want to get tested very frequently, maybe that's an alternative. But I think this is how you flank Facebook and say the daily choices in your life need to be such that we don't want you to be part of the spread of contagion unknowingly. And this is why, because we got young people, we got older people, we've got people who've had HIV, we've had people who've had transplants. We can't in good conscience say, go be around those people and be unvaccinated. You don't want to be vaccinated for yourself. That's a personal decision. You just can't, we can't allow you to be part of the chain of transmission. That's the fact. And we got to be strong about that, my opinion.
One of the things you did early on in the epidemic, as you describe in your book, is you sort of came up with a manifesto to send to all the governors. And it was very interesting how that was a litmus test for how people would respond. Some picked up the phone and were engaged right away, and others, of course, did not. And I'm wondering what you think would happen if you were to chart out these guidelines for today to the governors. Do you think we've made any progress? Will there be a different reaction?
You know, it's funny, at that point in time, like I didn't realize that people would go into different camps about how they would respond to this. Like I was very naive. Like the thing that I felt stupidest about in 2020 was I honestly thought that we wouldn't have a pandemic that it would have a civil war on top of the pandemic. I honestly thought that there was a reasonable chance that we would actually come together and treat this through something that wasn't political. And that was very foolish on my part. But I'll tell you, if it happened again, I'd only be a little chastened because I'm a bit of an idealist and a bit of an optimist. And so I thought that people would react to this the same way they would react if their state were attacked, because their state was being attacked, and if their hospitals were being attacked, and if their nurses and doctors were being attacked, and that they would say, I want a very practical playbook. And so I sent this manifesto out after calling a bunch of former CDC people, a bunch of people in states, a bunch of people who have run crises before, and said, look, here's the first 10 things you need to do. And then I published it in the newspaper with a bunch of people who signed on to it saying, these are the practical steps you need to do. I didn't think they were controversial. And, you know, I think today, nobody even calls or talks to, nobody I know on a national level calls Ron DeSantis or Greg Abbott, and Republicans or Democrats, scientists or not, they don't feel it's worthwhile to even call them. So people have now decamped to their points of view, I guess.
Well, yeah, you're getting at what I was trying to eke out of you earlier, which is the political divisiveness that wouldn't have been anticipated. I share your perspective that we had a common enemy of a really formidable virus, and we basically collapsed in this country. And we have remained in that state of not having unity. It's really held us back. And here we are, 65th in the world for fully vaccinated. We're lagging way behind in boosters. But in addition to the political divisiveness, I want to get your comment about the infighting at the leadership of the government. So back in August, President Biden made an announcement that boosters are going to be needed in adults, and we're going to come up with a plan. Then he had the CDC and a couple of, rogue scientists, if you want to call them that, at the FDA going after that. And, basically it was a lot of backtracking, a lot of mixed messages, 8 months, 5 months, no, this maybe not, yes. I mean, it's unbelievable, really, Andy. So here we are, we have this really tough political fight to who would ever have guessed. Then we have infighting with our own agencies that you know very well because you were communicating on their behalf and moderating these discussions. And I'm just amazed by that, because this idea which was right in August, Tony called the shot, right? I mean, he doesn't call the shots. We don't have a czar, of the pandemic, really. And so this is a problem. And now we have a terrible, we need the boosters as one line of defense against Omicron, and we're not moving again. So what do you think about this?
Boy, it's really interesting. Like, let's say in the benefit of hindsight, you got scientists who say things that just turn out not to be right, who say, we don't need boosters, right? But the scientific process normally allows for a little bit of debate, and the scientific process doesn't work well when people's voices are suppressed. And I think back to the Trump administration when, people in the FDA or CDC would say something and get fired or get taken out for it. And I think about other countries where, you have what you hear is only what the government wants you to hear. So then what do? You get a couple of scientists who say, I don't know that we need boosters or whatever. And they're wrong, and they publish it in a magazine. In some ways, I think the best thing you can do is in many ways, oddly enough, invite that and say, look, what we're going through is real-time decision-making state of the science, and you're never going to get 100 out of 100 people to agree. We're not going to suppress their ability, their right to say it. But we are going to make a call based upon the preponderance of the science, and the preponderance of the science is X. But, there was a lot of real frustration with these guys, understandably so. But in some respects, what you'd want to say is, look, guys, you sure you want to publish this? But I would stop short of probably saying you can't publish it, because then you got a scandal where it looks like you're not comfortable with the truth coming out. What it does is it creates an obligation on, because instantly what they've done is becomes fodder for the misinformation folks. And it's just a byproduct of having a free society. And I would have been plowing those guys with information that they did not have, to get them to keep, and once the genie's out of the bottle, you got to keep pushing on it. I think that in some ways I can't pin down what, we have this 14% rate of people being boosted. We're doing about 1 million a day. If you said, boy, if we hadn't had those conversations in August, would we be at 20% or 20%? I don't know that we would. I think, I remember when Pfizer came out and said, guys, we're all going to need to get boosted. Look what's happening in Israel. You saw that. You said that. And you're like, one of the mental mistakes I think a bunch of people made, and I'm willing to say that I'm part of that, is we were so wanting to be so clear about how good vaccines were that many people feel oversold. Instead of saying, this is one of the best tools we have, we kind of said, hey, 98%, you probably won't need masks, no more transmission, et cetera. We didn't account for waning. We certainly didn't account for Delta. And so then we came back and later said, hey, the vaccines are good, but not perfect. They're still important. It looked like backtracking to people. It looked like we were saying, and people were able to poke holes in vaccines. And then rather than say, yeah, those are legitimate questions, which by the way, you, Eric, did, said, we guys have got to be honest about this. There are others that were like, no, we got to go to the mat and keep the story simple and say vaccines are perfect. Vaccines are great. And I think that was regretful.
I think the other factor that is happening right now is that we're all weary. I see that in my house staff on the wards. I mean, they are just tired, even though our COVID numbers are very reasonable now, but we don't know what to expect, and they are just tired. I mean, I would venture to say you're probably a little tired too. I mean, you were the idealist who held the town forums about Obamacare. I sense that you're probably not optimistic that kind of thing can work as well, engaging in the public in town forums and bringing them around.
Well, I probably have a pathological need to do stuff. That's my saving grace. So I can't feeling helpless is a shitty feeling. No one and so no one likes it. So I'm not saying I don't ever go there or get there, but you surround yourself with doers, people like Eric and others. You're inspired to know that you can always make a difference and do stuff. So I feel useful. Maybe I kid myself in feeling useful, but at least it keeps me feeling positive. But look, in our own lives, in all of our own lives, I think everybody asks themselves the question, how bad does it have to be before I go back to doing things that are less safe? And the truth of the matter is, this is where the virus is really tricky, is, there are a lot of people who the rational response is, they're probably not going to die. And the burden always falls disproportionately in certain communities. In places where those burdens don't fall disproportionately, people will more and more be in a place where they say, they're willing to live with much more risk because the risk doesn't necessarily fall to them. And I'd say, okay, reasonable, but the things that we're asking of you are not monumental. To wear a mask around other people. It's get vaccinated and get boosted if you're going to be around other people. It's take rapid at-home tests if you're going to have people to your house. I mean, these are things that, like, my God, I mean, if this were World War II, people went months without coffee. I can't go a morning without coffee, but no one's asking me to. People are just asking, like, anything you do is ridiculous. We live in Los Angeles. My wife went an hour out of Los Angeles into a convenience store wearing a mask, and there were 7 people in the convenience store, including 3 that worked there, and they laughed at her hysterically. An hour outside of an urban metropolitan area in a convenience store, people thought it was insane that she went in to pay for something and was wearing a mask. That's an hour outside, right? We've just gotten ourselves to a place where there's very thin ground of reasonable, where we can just say, yeah, let's all agree that this is reasonable.
Well, on the reasonable front, on the rapid tests, as you well know, many countries have made that either free or subsidized them greatly. And of course, last week when it was confronted during a press conference with Jen Psaki, she said, we just can't afford to do this. What's your sense about rapid tests? Because we only have a few that are cleared by the FDA, whereas the EMA has, 70, 80 are cleared, and we're not distributing them. And there's hard to find, and there's even a lot better tests than the ones that are out there. What do you think?
Well, I'd go to Congress, which is a hard thing to do, and I'd ask for $50 to $100 billion for a rapid at-home test, kind of make them ubiquitous.
Yeah.
And I think eventually to pair them with therapies, because right, they're going to be, by the middle of next year, we're going to have some amount, not as much as we would hope for, but some amount of availability of these oral therapeutics. And if I have the ability to get an unlimited amount of at-home tests, then in some ways, like, the pandemic doesn't, not that it doesn't faze me, it's that I can feel a sense of optimism that I can lead my life going into the pandemic. And then, by the way, like, only jerks go out in public when they know they've got the flu. Oh, some people do it, but they're jerks. So if people test positive at an rapid at-home test, one would like to think that the majority of them are just not going to want to go infect other people. So it's going to have a really positive impact on our lives. It's going to have a positive impact on the pandemic. Is that worth $50 to $100 billion? Yes. Wish we didn't have to spend it on that, but yes. And then I would send it out everywhere. In the meantime, if they say they can't do it without that money, I would be on the phone with every insurance company CEO, and I'd say, look, y'all are on the hook to pay for these things. Go buy them in bulk and send them to your members. Send a certain amount every month, and I'd start with low and middle income folks, because people who are upper income can afford them. Now we have 8 tests approved. The other question is volume. I think one of the things that we're not doing is buying these made in China tests that other countries in Europe are. I don't know enough to know whether we're making a mistake or they're making a mistake, but there's some difference of opinion. We put $3 billion into additional scale-up manufacturing. Of that 50 to 100 billion, I'd take another 10 or 20, because I do believe that is one very no regret decision, and it's got to pay back. I mean, if that doesn't pay back in terms of packed stadiums and the economy and football and keeping hospitals open for other kinds of healthcare that people need, that, I imagine it's a great investment.
Circling back to your book where we started, I must say I'm really struck by the fact that the business mindset that you brought to sorting out the Obamacare problem, to sorting out the healthcare issues that you saw a friend of yours, widow, faced with. It just highlights the fact that many of us in medicine are simply not equipped to think about things strategically that way, and people in politics are certainly not. And it doesn't seem to me that we've found a way to formalize the appointment of people like you to really run the government, run the healthcare system in a managerial sense. We keep appointing people whose expertise is slightly tangential, or they got the most votes. And, as a populist, this is not a good way to go. To me, it could be a case study for a business school, all the different problems that we saw along the way and that you describe in Preventable.
It's organizing the U.S. healthcare system. So we have this I forget. I want to give credit to the person who said it, but someone who said recently, the U.S. healthcare system is bigger than the economy of Italy and about as well organized. and that only a fool would say that they can come in and reorient the government of Italy to be, because systemically, it's such a good comparison, because systematically, it is, I think it's inherent with the same type of corruption. And by corruption, I just mean there are moneyed interests that drive so much of what we do and supersede so much of what's in the common good. There are 50 different economies within healthcare. There's a $30 billion health information technology EMR economy, and no one likes their freaking technology. So how did that get to be a $50 billion or $100 billion economy? We've got economies of PBMs, people who do nothing but say, hey, keep your prices high and I'll get it lower and I'll take a piece of the difference. We got it's a several $100 billion industry alone. So we have all of these things inside healthcare, and you could take as many well-intentioned people doing well-intentioned things, and they find eventually that they're running up against forces that are too big. Now, I think we need to both fight those things and overwhelm them with positive forces. I mean, Eric's involved in so many things around innovation where it's like, okay, can we take that negative and twist it to a positive by saying, okay, let's do the things we do really well. Let's innovate, let's solve these problems. And indeed, those things happen and they're very encouraging and they help us make progress. But if at the end of the day, we've got a country where half the people can't afford it, where 1 out of 4 people can't afford to fill a prescription because the whole thing is just a mess of expense, then we're in a tough spot. So it takes a lot of people and a lot of types of thinking to address these things.
Andy, you're kind of a Mission Impossible guy. You're like Mr. Phelps, call him in, run Obamacare. Oh, by the way, why don't you run this vaccine campaign, help get this communicated? The American healthcare system as well as anyone I know, really, because you're on the inside, and you've seen it in different pre-pandemic lights, intra-pandemic. You wrote a book in real time, essentially, about the pandemic. What I want to get from you in wrapping up here is we're going to write the history books, and it's now 2030 something, right? And we gotten through this messy times, right? It's endemic. Hopefully we haven't had another freaking pandemic by then. What's the history going to say about the United States and its ability to meet this virus and to try to prevail over it?
I think we'll look back and give ourselves an A or an A- in science, in what I call the hard science. And people don't like when I say hard sciences versus soft sciences, but you know what I mean. And I think we'll get a D- or an F in the social sciences. I think the mRNA platform is a beautiful story. I think the work of scientists around the country and in the world on a distributed basis to sequence and share information and create therapeutics and I think our agencies, when you look back at FDA, I think, forget real time, they'll get high marks for getting a lot of stuff approved rapidly. I think tests, I couldn't agree with you more. We need more tests, but in the main, I think we will feel like, boy, the state of our science was really showed well, and that should be encouraging for our future. And if we directly apply all of this to something like climate change or biodiversity crisis or whatever, you have to say, I feel optimistic about that. But on the other side of things, human understanding of other people's cultures, empathy, the kind of common good, sociology, willingness to sacrifice for one another, all of those things at a human level, the political science. I mean, you name the class. It's like, I feel like we all should have gone to school and paid attention to the classes that we kind of didn't take as seriously because we didn't think they mattered or they thought they were easy. But that's the stuff that really tripped us up. And I don't think we have a lot to be proud of societally with who we showed up to be. Now, individually, like Abraham, the doctors and nurses in your facility, like there's so many heroic stories. There's so many inspiring people out there, people listening to you guys who listen to this podcast, who, I mean, I get sometimes teary-eyed thinking about the heroic work people have done, because everything we fail at as a society falls on the shoulders and the backs of people in the healthcare system when it shows up. And nobody was trained to do it. Nobody was prepared to do it. Nobody was expected to have to do it. Yet people showed up every day and did it. So, I think the report card will show individual heroism, societal disappointment, and I think at least a very, very encouraging mark from what science did.
I actually think that history will speak very well of individuals like yourself and Eric, who put yourselves out there and you keep hammering away with the message, and I'm sure you get a lot of nasty pushback, but in your own ways, I think that's been an important part of drawing the line and not backing away. And I think history will remember that. So it's been a great pleasure for me to read your book and get to talk to you. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank
Andy,
you.
thanks so much for what you've done for the country. Beating your head against the wall, I'm sure, many days throughout. And we hope that we can keep turning to you for a lot of wisdom and leadership and communication. You're a model of that. And thanks for joining us today and helping to illuminate the Medscape audience.
Thank you. Thanks for all you guys do.